top 10 80s Doctor Who soundtracks. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now this is something I haven't done before, ranking my favourite musical scores from Doctor Who, classic Who anyway. Now rather than try and do a top 10 for the entire thing, I'm going to split it into decades. So this is my top 10 favourite music scores for 80s stories. Number 10, The Curse of Fenric. This is Mark Ayres' third score for the series, and I think it's an absolute classic. It suits the tone, the atmosphere, and the mood of this wonderful Sylvester McCoy story to a T. There's appropriate and kind of military themes to it, but an overall sense of darkness and doom. It's a terrific score for a terrific story. 9. Earthshock. Malcolm Clarke's score for Earthshock. One of the absolute best, certainly the best score in the whole of season 19. I love Earthshock. The Return of the Cybermen is a brilliant story, and his music gives this the oomph that it really needs to make it stand out and make it memorable. The Cyber March theme is one of the most memorable themes in the history of the show. It's a brilliant soundtrack for a brilliant story. 8. Ghostlight. It's Mark Ayres again. This was the second of his 3 scores, so I guess technically it was... No, I guess technically this was his third, because actually Curse of Fenric kind of came first, even though they switched them around in transmission. Oh, well, never mind. Ghostlight is another very atmospheric, creepy, spooky Sylvester McCoy story, and again, it's another beautifully appropriate, beautifully atmospheric, beautifully spooky soundtrack that brings the story's atmosphere into sharp focus. It's another great soundtrack. I have heard the argument that there's perhaps a little bit too much of it, but that argument seems a little bit superfluous in the wake of New Who, which is completely drowned in the stuff. So it doesn't really hold up, does it, that argument? 7. The Five Doctors. Peter Howell's one and only appearance on this list. Howell is most famous, of course, for composing the 80s rearrangement of the theme that lasted from seasons 18 all the way through to seasons 22. And The Five Doctors is a beautiful score. Love The Five Doctors. It's the very best anniversary story. Actually, I'm recording this, believe it or not, in October, so no one's even seen the 60th anniversaries yet. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say The Five Doctors is still the best anniversary story. Maybe I'll change my mind. I'm not holding my breath. And it's a great score. I mean, it's a wonderfully classic score. You've got the Horn of Rassilon theme mixed into there. It's a real standout score in an era that, to my mind, doesn't have some of the best scores. What was that? That was number 7, wasn't it? 6. Greatest Show in the Galaxy. Mark Ayres, again, making his third and final appearance in this list, ironically with his first composed story. Again, much like Ghostlight and Curse of Fenric, it's a spooky, creepy story that needs a creepy, spooky soundtrack, and it's got one. This one has a little bit of a different tone to it, of course, because it's also kind of got the whole it's got this sort of sinister, jolly theme to it that sums up the circus atmosphere very nicely. It's just another beautifully atmospheric score, and let's be honest, the McCoy era was filled with some beautifully atmospheric scores. 5. Attack of the Cybermen. Malcolm Clarke. Now, I know this one will cause a bit of eyebrow raising. I love the soundtrack to Attack of the Cybermen. Obviously, it reuses some of the ones from Earthshock, mainly the Cyber March theme, which is awesome. But I like the soundtrack in general. I even like some of the stuff that some people whinge and whine about. I think the soundtrack for some of the early stuff with Lytton and his gang and all of that sort of stuff, I think it's beautifully appropriate for scenes that have a real kind of Sweeney-esque vibe to them. I'm sorry, I've never understood some of the criticism of the music in this story. I think it's got the kind of the militaristic appeal of Earthshock, but adds to that with some really fun, quirky, characterful stuff as well. Sorry, I love Attack of the Cybermen's music. 4. Dragonfire. This is from Dominic Glynn, probably my favourite music composer of the 80s themes. Dragonfire, it's the score is so different to the rest of season 24, which was done by Kev McCulloch. Now, Deaf Kev, as some call him, not me, of course. I would never do such a thing. I don't mind Kev McCulloch's scores. I think Remembrance is probably his best, but there is a pretty big difference between his stuff and the other two main composers of the McCoy era, which is Dominic Glynn and Mark Ayres. And this is a much more atmospheric, moody piece of work. It's so much so that it doesn't even necessarily fit the story, because Dragonfire is still basically a bit of a comedic runaround. But the music gives it so much more weight and atmosphere. I think at the time it was an absolute revelation as a music score, especially, as I've said, coming after the rest of season 24's music. I think it's beautifully atmospheric, and it is no wonder that he got more work, frankly. 3. The Happiness Patrol. Dominic Glynn, again, for the second time in this list. Again, The Happiness Patrol is obviously a very quirky, very weird story. It's got some of the kind of Greatest Show atmosphere, and that there's a kind of a jolliness to it that's not really jolly, and it's all very creepy and sinister. And again, the soundtrack is beautifully representative of that. I love the score for the Candy Kitchen. I mean, it's a great set, but the score emphasizes it so much. There is I think I've said this before, there's a very Danny Elfman scoring a Tim Burton movie feel to this music, and I think it's beautifully appropriate for this story. Okay, on to the top 2. 2. State of Decay. Reaching back to the early days, I think this is Paddy Kingsland's best score for the series. I adore State of Decay. Regular viewers will know that I adore State of Decay. And I think, again, the music is absolutely beautiful. It's certainly the standout score of season 18 for me. It's a standout story of season 18. It's a great gothic story, gothic horror, vampires, and the music score meets what you need for a story of that ilk. It's wonderfully atmospheric, wonderfully creepy. I don't mind some of Kingsland's other ones. Mordrin Undead only just missed this list by a hair's whisker, but to my mind, State of Decay is by far his best. And number 1, my absolute number 1 favourite musical score for Doctor Who in the 1980s. It's our man Dominic Glynn again. You know what I'm going to say. It's Survival. Survival has one of the richest music scores of any Doctor Who story ever. It's so gorgeous and so atmospheric and so lush. I love Survival. I think it's a fantastic story. I think it's a great ending to real Doctor Who, basically. And I think the score absolutely does it justice and even takes it to another level. All 3 of Dominic Glynn's scores for the McCoy era are in this top 10. It's an indication of how much I love that era as well. But I think Survival is the absolute top score for the 1980s version of Doctor Who.